Hello and welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can export a scene from Maya that contains some instance objects and import it into Unreal, and also maintain that all those instances remain intact so you have full parity between your scene in Maya and your scene in Unreal. I'm then also going to show you how you can then replace those instances in Unreal with an entirely new object. Okay, so we're inside Maya 2022. This is the data set that I'm going to use. I've kept the scene very simple, and I've been using some components of the Bistro exterior data set that you can download online. And if you want access to this data set, then I'll include a link in the description below. Now, what we want to do in this data set is create a number of instances in our scene as if we were populating this environment ourselves. And then we want to export those instances, in fact, the entire scene, into Unreal. Now, why would you want to do that in Maya and not just export everything into Unreal? Well, you could be just more comfortable and just in the way you work, it could just be easier to do it inside Maya or 3ds Max for that matter. The issues with instancing in Unreal are that it's okay, it works, but it takes a little bit to set up. And if you're not comfortable about going into Blueprint, or you frankly don't have the time, then you're not really going to want to pursue that workflow. You're going to want to do it in a package you're familiar with, set your scene up, and then you want to maintain that scene and get that all into Unreal. Scenario we're going to use is we've got these objects here. I've got a hierarchy all set up in my outliner, and this is important. It's always important to keep your scene tidy and clean, and this will really make a difference once you start exporting data to Unreal. And you want to also maintain this hierarchy as well. Now, I've just done some very crude grouping. Now, I've got a parent object here. This is one street lamp. So this is going to be my parent object, and I want to have multiples of this in my scene. Of course, the most simple workflow is to just Control D and duplicate it, and then I can move it to wherever I want. Well, that's fine, but then what you're doing is you're essentially creating multiple copies, as in individual objects, assets in your scene of the same core asset. And if this asset is not going to change, if it's going to remain the same, then that creates a bigger overhead in your scene. The more objects you create, then the more complex it becomes, and the scene can get very big. If you're only duplicating the original object, say 3 or 4 times, then that could be fine. But if you're then having to do a significant amount of copies of this object in your scene to populate a large level, then the number of assets is really going to go up. You could be into the 10s, 20s, 30s, even more into the hundreds. And that's a lot of work to duplicate and also export that data. So a way that many people adopt is by using instances. So this is when they take the same object and also duplicate it, but you're not actually creating a duplication of the object. You're not copying the entire object itself. What you're doing is essentially you're copying the display of the object. You're copying what's being rendered and then moving that to wherever you want it to. So this just take this object here and delete it and go back to my original source asset. And first thing to note is I've got everything on the ground. I've got all my transformations frozen out. This is at world center, and I want to keep it at world center. This is going to be my parent object. I don't want to move it. What I want to do is create duplicates of this object and place those instead. Also notice that I've got my pivot sitting at the base of the object. And I like to do this when dealing with hard surface objects because you very often want to align them to a surface. In this case, it's a flat road. But if it was going uphill slightly, or maybe there was different contours to the landscape, then it will always, you can always have it aligned to the top of the surface. But of course, you can change that. Now, what we're going to do is take the same option we would do otherwise, but this time we'll go to Duplicate Special. Can choose the little box to bring up our options. But this time we're going to choose instance. Now, in terms of the grouping, it's the same options as you would do if you were duplicating actually duplicating the object. Number of copies, you could do a transform here, offset. So if you wanted to distribute these and have spaces in between them, then you can just put a value here, put there, apply, and you can see I've created my instances. And then they're in increments to spread them out and distribute them however I see fit. Now, I'm not going to do that because I want to individually place these assets. So upon resetting my transforms, I'm just going to choose Duplicate Special and I've now got 5 instances in my scene of the same object. Now we can place these to wherever we want, and you'll notice that here that the transforms are the same, and of course we're just going to put them to wherever we want to place them individually. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the difference then? Same workflow, same transformations, why don't I just duplicate the object instead? It's a lot easier and maybe quicker. Well, there can be some significant advantages to working this way. And one of those is with instances is, one, the scene becomes lighter. You're not actually duplicating the entire object again with all its data. You're essentially duplicating the representation of it. And because of that, it's a lot cheaper in terms of memory and also scene size. So instancing is very good if you want to have a lot of objects of the same type. What's also good about is if you want to manipulate the object in any way. This, say for example, you want to make a change to this object. You may want to add, you may have seen a problem with the verts, or you want to extrude some faces, or you just want to do something to this mesh. Now, if you were to just go into your component mode and select the vertices here, notice how they're all selected now on my instances. So if I now make a change, so I want to make it taller, you'll see that that change is replicated in my instances. And I can keep it like this if I want to. Now, if this was a copy, that wouldn't work. It would just do it on this object, and I then have to equally apply the same edits on each copy individually, which is okay with maybe 3 or 4 objects, but when you've got 300 or 400 objects, it's simply not practical. You could create scripts to do it and tooling to do it, but if you don't have access to that at all, then it's not really going to work for you. So that's one of the advantages of having and also using instances. So I've got this done already. What I've also got is I've got another little small object here, and I'm going to do the same with this just to add a bit of variety. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to do the same thing, but this time just choose 4. That's now done, and I'm just going to place these here either side of this bike, this Vespa. There, and then the other 2 on the other side of the street. Okay, that's done. So the scene is now ready to export. So we've got everything laid out, and we could have had more objects if we wanted to. The first thing to do is do not do freeze transformations on anything, because if you do that, you'll wipe out the X and Y value, which is what you need, because this is how Unreal is going to recognize the placement of this object. And that becomes crucial when it comes to swapping the object out with another object entirely. You want to keep the transforms, otherwise it just won't work. So with that in mind, that's all kind of done. We're not going to do anything there. So what we now want to do is, you'll notice that our hierarchy is fine. Our instances are all set underneath the same group nodes. We now want to export everything into one FBX file. So I'm just going to go File, Export, and we're going to choose this file here, and we're just going to overwrite it. Before we do that, there's an option here that you need to be aware of, and that's underneath the geometry section of the FBX export options. You want to make sure Preserve Instances is turned on. This way, what this will do, it will retain the instances in the FBX file. If you turn it off, they won't be recognized, and when you open it, you'll just get one street lamp and nothing else placed. So you want to maintain the instances here. So now we're just going to export all, and then we should be good to go. Okay, now jumping over into Unreal, we want to import our FBX scene, our entire FBX scene, into Unreal. We've got a simple level here with all the default assets. Now, the way you might go about it is just right-clicking in the content browser and just going to File, Import Asset. Well, this is okay when you're working with individual files, individual assets that you want to bring in as a static mesh. These options are fine, but they don't really present anything about the hierarchy, the scene, the individual assets, how you want those assets to be handled. Those options are just not here at all. So we're going to cancel that, and instead what we're going to do is go to File, Import into Level. Then when we choose this and we choose the same asset again, it's now going to ask us where we want to place the contents of that file when we import it. So I'm just going to choose a test directory. And now we're presented with a different set of options. These are the FBX scene import options. On the left, we've got the hierarchy. So we can see inside the scene, the FBX file, we can see the hierarchy and the objects we're going to be importing. We can even choose to turn different actors on and off, really depending on our own individual choices. But we can explore the hierarchy here before we then import it. There's also options here to look at as well, which I think are really quite important. The first option is to create a content folder hierarchy. And what this does, it looks at the hierarchy of the scene file and then creates different subfolders for each one of these actors, like the bollards, the curb, street, and so on. And then inside that folder, it will place all the necessary assets. And that's really handy in keeping things organized, which is really what you want when you've got a big scene with multiple objects and meshes in it. The next important one is the hierarchy type. Now, there's three options here. You can import as level actors. So every actor for every node in the hierarchy is going to get everything is going to get an actor, basically. You could create one actor with components, which is okay, but I think somewhat limited. Or you could just bring in one blueprint and a component for every node inside the FBX hierarchy. So this is a somewhat hybrid between the two, and you get the option of having it as a blueprint. I prefer to go with create level actors because I think this is the most cleanest. And again, if you're not bothered about using blueprint for this part of it, then you don't want to complicate it anymore. So create level actors. That's it. I'm not going to touch anything else. There's options here around the static meshes about what to do as well. And this is the same thing as if you were bringing in an individual asset. Also skeletal meshes and also the materials as well. But we're going to not focus on them. We're just going to choose these two options here and then import. Okay, that's completed. Took about somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds. And aside from any shader compiles, this is it. It's brought in our entire scene. So this is exactly how it looks inside Maya. If we just jump over to Maya, we can see that it's exactly the same. All our objects are placed in exactly the spots where we put them. We just take a look for a moment. If we look at the content browser, we've got inside the folder I chose to import my data, I've got this node here. I've also got then a folder for the assets itself. And if we export that, if we go into that, we can see we've got a folder now for each one of the grouping in the hierarchy. And inside that will be the mesh and also the textures that are required for it. And if we look at all the other folders as well, it's exactly the same. There's our static meshes and then all the necessary materials and texture maps. So everything is exactly where we want it to be, and we've got a nice neat hierarchy and structure in the content browser so we can get to things very quickly. We look at the world outliner now, we can see that there's our parent root node, and underneath it we've got all our actors there set out exactly how we laid them out inside Maya. So we've retained the same hierarchy that we had inside Maya. FBX has brought that across no problems at all. And that's it. We've got everything there exactly how we want it to be. There's our main parent object as well. We've also got the original bollards asset in there as well, and then our instances are exactly where we placed them. So now we've got that. That's all working. So that's the first step. So now we're able to bring in an entire scene from Maya that's got instance objects in it, and we can see they're all retained, and everything's displayed inside our Unreal scene exactly how we want them to be. What do you do now if you want to now replace some of these instances or all of them with an entirely different object? Well, it's actually really quite simple. We're going to choose perhaps maybe these bollards first of all. First off, we want to choose what object do we want to replace it with. Now, I've gone to Megascans and just imported two types of traffic cones. We've got a yellow one and we've got a red and white one. Now, we've got two options. We could just drag the actor into our scene if we want to, or we could just select it from the content browser. So we'll do the first option of looking at just selecting it from the content browser. So first off, we want to choose the instances, which of course are these numbers here, 1 to 4. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go to our content browser and select the asset that we want to bring in. Now we go back to our outliner with our instances still selected. Right click this to bring up the menu and scroll to the very bottom, and you'll see there's a section that says replace selected actors with, and it will highlight the static mesh that you've got selected from your content browser. All we do is just select that, and we can see that these objects have now been replaced with the cone. And you'll notice they're in situ and placed exactly where we'd placed the original object. Now we can also do the same for the street light. So let's choose our instances there. And well, actually this time what we'll do, we'll bring the cone, this cone, into our scene. And now what we'll do, we'll select our instances. We'll choose our asset here, right click, and you'll notice that this asset now is highlighted. Select that, and it's now replaced those street lights with these cones, and the grouping still works. So of course I've still got my parent object here, and I can move things up and down, and when I move it, all my assets will go with it, exactly how an instance object should work. If I want to, I've got the option to also replace individual assets. For example, we could say, well, actually, this instance here, I want to replace that. Actually, let's just get that down to 0 again. This asset, this instance, I want to replace with this cone. That's not a problem. We've got our instance selected here in our outliner. Choose the asset here. Right click here, and we've just swapped that out. Perfect. So that's now how you swap out the instances with an entirely different object. Now you can do this with all the other actors as well, but there can be a problem here, and this is where it's worthy to talk about it. So let's choose one of these street bollards here. So we're going to choose the one at the very top, and we might say, we know what, this is a perfect candidate. I want to put my cone here. So this isn't an instance, it's a duplicated object, but the workflow is exactly the same, the process. I select my object, I then go to my, select my object in the content browser, right click it, and now you'll notice that it's still selected here. You'll also notice that in the other menu here, it will highlight anything I've recently selected or recently placed in the scene. So again, it's good to have these options here, but I'm just going to choose it here, and it's done. But now it's gone. So where's it actually gone? Well, where it's gone is over here. It's gone to World Center. We can look at the transforms here. So why has that happened when we've got the objects actually placed over here? Why has that not worked when, look, my object is placed here? Well, if we select that, look where our pivot is. Our pivot is actually at World Center. There's no transforms on here at all. So that's why it's not worked. Now, if we were to move this and added a transform, and let's say I'll put it right there, and now decided to replace this, you'll see it's now placed it in the middle of the ground. So what will happen is that when you do the replace actor, it will place it where the pivot is, which is kind of really what it should be, which is why they didn't work. And it's the same with all these other assets, because that's how they are inside Maya. If we go back to Maya for a moment, we can see all these objects. The transforms have all been reset and frozen. So essentially that's put the pivot at the world center, which is perfectly fine. That's nothing wrong with that. But if you've got to have assets that are going to be placed and populated in your scene, you're going to want to have transformation values on them. Otherwise, yes, you can swap the actors out, but you're then going to have to go here and start moving them to wherever you want. And of course, now the object has got the same pivot as the traffic cone, and I can move it to wherever I want. So this is one of the things you've got to be very mindful of in terms of when you're bringing things in from packages like Max and Maya, in terms of the pivot and the scaling. If there's a transform on it in any way, then what will happen is that Unreal will swap the actor out, no problem, but it can apply that offset. So that's where things can get a little bit complicated. So it's always best to have a good process when you're working inside Maya when it comes to instance assets. These things here, you're not going to swap these out because they're part of your environment. So that's something to just be mindful of if you're working with instances. They can sometimes trip you up, but I think if you have a solid process inside your source package like Maya, and what I've done here is I've kept my parent object at world 0, and then I've moved my instances to where I want to place them, then you should be fine and you'll be able to swap the assets out no problem. Okay, so to prove this actually works in another package, 3ds Max, I've just got the same, even simpler setup. The Utah teapot, it has to be Utah teapot because we're in 3ds Max. And I've just done the same basic process, this time using Max's instancing, which is in object, shift, drag, and then you get the option to go copy instance or reference, and then export FBX in the same way. Then imported them in. So here we are, here's our dummy object. Everything's all kind of set how we want it to. So now we can choose our objects, choose our traffic cone, and then just right click and swap it out. Although we do get this really monster asset, it's just really the scaling. So you can quickly just get this back down and you've got everything pretty much how you expect it to. So it's just sometimes Max can be a bit funny on the scaling, on how it translates into Unreal, but apart from that, you can see you can swap it out. And of course, once you've got the scaling set, which is usually just a simple value, you can easily just change out the assets to whatever you want, like so, and that's kind of how that works. Now there is another way to bring stuff in which you might prefer, especially if you're using 3ds Max, and that is via Datasmith. Now it'll work in exactly the same way, but it's worth just checking out the documentation online, because there's a whole section about using Datasmith with 3ds Max, and also it mentions specifically about instances. But what it's basically saying here is that if you have instances in your Max scene, then Datasmith will detect those and it will only create one static mesh asset for that object. So pretty much kind of as you would expect, and exactly the same way in which we've got in Unreal here. There's only one teapot, there's not actually multiple teapots. It's the fact is that that's the one mesh that's come in and it's been instanced. So it works in exactly the same way. One thing to also be mindful of is how Datasmith handles things like pivot points. Now you can edit the pivot points in Max like you can with Maya. It's got here, however, in Unreal Engine, all instances of the same geometry need to use the same pivot point. So Datasmith translates your objects to Unreal. It handles those pivot points as follows. It mentions about how it does it, and if you've got an offset, it can often apply that automatically. So I would do some tests just to make sure it kind of works, but I think you'll find once you get the hang of it, it will work no problem. But the main thing is that your instances will come across no problem. So you can now create a scene in Max or create a scene in Maya, use as many instances as you like, and you can export them via FBX or Datasmith into Unreal. And then once you're in Unreal, just swap out the instances with any object of your choosing. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.